Ladies and gentlemen, it is Wednesday. We got Tim Seavey here from San Diego State University.
Woo-woo.
Yeah, I am Jared Kapiga-Miller, your debate coach, communications professor, coming to you from St. Charles, Missouri. I'm at the Phi Rho Pi National Tournament. Matt can't be with us. He's getting his Big Bird tattoo removed. Yeah.
That up with them woke Sesame Street? Is he just done with it?
Yeah.
Aren't we all?
Yeah, the Daffy Duck is next. All right. So
what are we discussing today? All the way from
we like to do the deep dive on the first week, right? Week 1 Wednesday. So we're doing our deep dive, and I just I picked up one of the topics from our NPDA rounds today, and it is all about universal preschool. The exact resolution, what is it? That the United States federal government should mandate universal free preschool.
All right.
There we go.
Interesting discussion. So a couple questions just as we have to do going through the resolution. Yeah. When they say mandate and free preschool, the federal government does not fund schools. Like, they offer some funds for schools, but funding for schools generally is decided by and come up with by the state. So that already gets in a little bit tricky waters. Like, if the federal government is going to mandate something, like, they can have funding sources for it, the way that like they'll fund, federal tests and things. But like, that's a pretty significant fund compared to testing or, some new single like requirement or drill or something. Like, that's a lot of money from the federal government, and then that's a lot of trust that the state's implemented the right way.
Well, you could go with the unfunded mandate approach, I guess. You know what I mean? It's like, hey, states, you got to make sure that this is covered. All right, so figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, I guess which is fairly brutal, right? Because like some states' education budgets are just like dismal compared to others, generally by their own hand, right? Like Nevada overinvests in all kinds of insane things and doesn't invest in education at all. They're like 49th in the union education. Woo, Nevada educated over here, but like they're always way back there because it's just their last priority on things. And so in that circumstance, the federal government's like, hey, fund this. And they'll be like, all right, a nickel each.
Yeah.
Each classroom is going to be doing great things. So I can see that being a real problem, is just, from a solvency perspective. Yeah. But I think the word mandate in this circumstance, I also think, does that trickle down to the parents in that are preschoolers or preschool age students mandated to attend?
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems so. It would probably be under the same sort of enforcement mechanism that we have for any other school. You know what I mean? That if you don't, register and enroll your kid into a school, then the parents, like, they start coming for the parents. You know what I mean? Yeah.
So like just truancy for 3-year-olds.
Yeah. I mean, like, that just seems like the most logical way to me. You know what I mean? That, like, otherwise you're going to have like some entirely different enforcement mechanism for the same thing. Usually.
Well, I mean, so I thought it was just, there was actually a legitimate question. It wasn't like trying to press on anything. It was really trying to understand, is this just mandating that states offer free preschool or mandating that students have to attend free preschool?
Ooh, I see what you're saying now.
That was the difference, because I was like, I think there are a lot of parents that like get daycare through their work, or that like actively choose to be stay-at-home parents until their child goes to first grade or whatever. But if we are now requiring students,
well, like, it's universal. It's a universal free preschool. Like, the word universal makes me think, yeah, you got to go. You know what I mean? It's like, it's for everyone. Like, if it was optional, it wouldn't be universal now, would it?
Well, then in that case, I see a ton more disadvantages than I saw before. Because just like reading through the literature, it's pretty straightforward that like access to even like moderate quality preschool education has just a litany of benefits in, the next developmental stages and later in life.
There's actually some mixed evidence, and it just came out really recently. I was amazed because I'm not too amazed. I follow the news, and so when I saw this, I'm like, oh, they must have read the same NPR article that I came across last week. And they found out that there is a wrong way to do preschool. It's like, you know what I mean? And so they did like this longitudinal study over a long period of time. They, followed some kids into the 6th grade. And for some reason, they were doing worse than their peers. And so this study from Dale Ferron, I believe it was, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but she's kind of hypothesizing that, there are ways to do preschool that actually have that backfire. And if you're trying to like just if they're like tracing letters and they have to sit and listen, for long periods of time, and if you're really trying to like get them this head start on reading and writing and math and stuff like that, that's actually worse. That the best, like they found way better results if they're just in preschool
mines and like other circumstances to extract salt.
Yeah,
our like childhood labor laws have gotten soft, like just nerf soft. And so I'm glad to hear that this woman's finally like, hey, there's a wrong way to do it, and it's coddling them. Now back to the mines.
It's daycare. Like daycare isn't necessarily school, right? It's just like, hey, your kids are safe and they're playing. You know what I mean? And so they found that like just having daycare it might be better than actually trying to do like the whole like curriculum in school. And now we're doing this lesson and that lesson, and anything that's really that structured at that young of an age can backfire. I don't know. They're thinking that like maybe there's like this rebellion sort of like thing that happens, like when you try to enforce rules way too early on somebody, they really start pushing back.
That's once again sounds American to me. Like, no. We'll make it softer and more open. But like, I guess Montessori is all about their free play, no rules, white bread lifestyle. And like, I don't know, like the kids come out of it seemingly well adjusted. But like, I think so the first thing out of the gate to me, which is probably not like a popular argument, but I think the
affirmative
stay at home option is like, that would be my immediate go-to of like, all right, there's obviously a variety of potential experiences that a kid has at home with their parent or with a, another family member or with like older siblings or whatever. There's a variety of experiences they're having everywhere from like, they're going to learn way more because they have like a really, really engaged, super attentive caregiver, all the way to like, getting into trouble or like sitting in front of a TV with like no supervision forever. So I'm sure that there's a range there, but I feel like parent rights has to start coming into this conversation when it's like a 3-year-old, like I think that should kind of still be up to a parent to choose whether or not their kid's ready for school. And I don't think that's up to the federal government to be like, nope, every 3-year-old climb on into the machine that produces better factory laborers. Because that's what like our typical education, our public education system does, is like makes really, really effective laborers. So like, I don't know, the more pessimist in me says like parents' rights, this should not be mandated. Maybe that's not what's implied by the resolution, but that would be one of the first arguments I come at it with.
Yeah, I do think that the affirmative could get away with a little bit of a plan spike. I mean, because there's parents who can, like withhold their child from, like when they register and stuff like that. I think that there's like some standard things that you could do, but like right now you don't even have to fill out those forms or do those applications if you don't want to send them to preschool. Post plan, you would have to do that, and so that would be the one thing. But I still think that the affirmative, if I was a judge, I'd let the affirmative get away with that. It's like, parents can withhold them if they want to, but they have to like consciously and clearly like say we are not doing this.
Okay.
So like
even with homeschool though, like parents are they're required to still like submit like curriculum and standards and like some sort of assessments, like this is what my child's done, and whether or not that like may be BS. I'm sure that there's all kinds of homeschooling programs around the country that like don't believe the current system and just make up their own really, really wild loose standards and still kind of get through the truancy laws. But I could see there being a little bit of challenge. So there's kind of the first thing that comes up to me. The second thing is the like ding to the private industry. And this argument, this debate comes up a whole lot in universal healthcare debates, right? Where it's like, well, if we create healthcare for everyone, what does that do to the poor insurance companies? Well, in healthcare, it's like, yeah, screw the insurance companies. Like private Medicare are evil, evil, evil organizations. But like, I don't think you'd find a lot of people that would believe that like most private preschools are evil. Like,
yeah,
they, for the most part, probably care about kids and probably like are full of, people that do good things to help kids. So I think there becomes this labor debate then where like the labor pool that's able to go and teach at a preschool typically does not have the same credentials and background as a school. And yet this is kind of removing the capability of going and working in a preschool because just there will be de facto no preschools. Like if it's required and universal and free, why would a private preschool exist other than like for some really elite, very expensive version or something? I see that industry taking a huge dive, and that could be a problem.
Now, in that same article, that brings up a good point. Like there's like New York, I think they took a different approach to universal healthcare or universal preschool, where they actually kind of directed the children to go to these pre-existing sort of like daycare centers and stuff like that. You know what I mean? So there are ways that you could do like this partnership. So I think that the affirmative, yeah, it's tricky for the affirmative, but if the affirmative is careful in crafting their plan, where it's going to be like this sort of like send them to pre-existing preschool daycare places, and that there's not a curriculum, it's more of like an arts and crafts and playtime, you know what I mean, like structured play sort of curriculum. But then, man, like you got to put a lot of detail in your plan now, and that starts getting a little tedious. So you got to find it's kind of difficult in 20-30 minutes to come up with a carefully crafted plan like that sometimes. You know what I mean? When you're on the fly and you only have one article that you're working off of.
I mean, especially if that's coming from like preempting negative arguments. Like if you're crafting your plan around expected preempted negative arguments,
yeah,
that's kind of tricky to do. And then I think like most negative teams would come at it with like if they do anything squirrely, like T mandate, T free, T pre-K, like just come up with a bunch of topicality shells already of like, all right, when they say mandate, they have to require it. What's your enforcement, right? Or they say it has to be free. Who's paying for it? Like, is it free to the states? Is it free to the parents? If it is it a voucher? Are they just giving cash? Like, I think I would get really pushy on the negative side with a lot of those specifics, and then, kind of force, like try and do that in, points of information or flex time. But I think that those are lots of areas for topicality. I think you're right. Kind of require an affirmative team to be super specific.
Yeah, you know what? I think after this discussion, I think if I had to do a plan text, the best one I could think of right now would be to actually the federal government funding. They actually provide the funding for what they call it a mixed delivery program. So they provide funding to set that some kids attend like free public school. Some of them go to like nonprofit daycare centers, and then there's like Head Start programs and traditional schools and stuff like that. And so you say we're going to use the New York model but nationwide.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that is like whenever you have a model to follow, or you know what I mean, that'll help your more helpful when you're putting together a plan text.
Yeah, and I imagine Europe probably does this really well because they tend to care about their small humans more than we do. I think there might be some interesting stuff in. So just so I'm clear, did you read anything on like students going to a variety of private daycares too? Because you mentioned these like nonprofits, and you mentioned like traditional schools. So like, are we sending kids to like KinderCare and like Montessori and like those types of schools, or are all of those kind of organizations and companies kind of getting the shaft out of this policy?
Yeah, I think you can still say that there's going to be plenty of private schools that will probably get hurt by this. Yeah. You know what I mean? Because if for no other reason than however much they're charging, now it's free. And if they don't get like, you're going to have to, if you're like one of these daycare centers, not all daycare centers are going to get covered, right? You have to qualify. somehow, some way. So there's going to be some qualification process, and then like some people are going to get in, some schools will get in, some won't. And so, yeah, I still think you have plenty of room for a disadvantage on that. Yeah.
I think you could probably have some conversations around like it becomes like the newest version of like redlining, or like it's like has the biggest negative impact on the most impoverished students, because like a lot of the stats and things that I was reading was talking about the effects of pre-K, particularly on more disadvantaged students, of like having a greater success in higher school, greater graduation rates, all kinds of really like wonderful benefits that we would want from education. But I think when you start talking about like how many of these schools are there in underprivileged areas, or in like more impoverished areas, or thinking about the number of like home-based daycare centers there are, right? Like that's a fairly common thing, I think, especially for like parents that already have children of that age but that need to make some kind of income. It's like, all right, well, I'm already taking care of kids, we got the space, this is now a daycare. And like that's a popular small business model that now would just not be able to exist, or would be like almost impossible to exist. So I think it's again kind of the universal healthcare, but to like the family-owned small clinic. Like, okay, well, does your universal healthcare policy qualify you into this and this and this and like all these other like specialty medical clinics that previously were small family-run operations that now are just not really feasible? So I never find the like, it's going to hurt businesses and hurt jobs is like the most compelling, but it's still one to just have in there because they've got to respond to it, and it's not nothing. Like it's still a real,
I think it isn't compelling if you don't make it personal and humane. And I think this one like gives you the ability to do that probably better than most other economic disadvantages. You know what I mean? Small business disadvantages, because like you could really visualize what these businesses are, and so not only that, but I think that you could even paint this picture that you're gonna kind of push the entire sort of daycare industry towards like a very corporate model, right? Something that has the infrastructure to do the paperwork needed to qualify for whatever federal funding that you're throwing their way, because they can write grants and they can hire lawyers and stuff like that, right? And so like you're killing all these. You're killing, and if you take that sort of evidence about how the education is administered, it determines its effectiveness. It specifically that like those home-based ones are probably way more likely to engage in learning play than corporate models. You know what I mean? Like corporate models are going to drill students. They're like, see, we got the curriculum, so give us our money type of approach. And that's exactly the wrong thing. And you're right. The article from NPR said that lower income communities are usually the worst hit because they're the ones who are least likely to like buy toys for play, and way more likely to just buy workbooks and drill students with lessons and stuff like that in order to like check off boxes and things.
Yeah. So I think there's definitely some like, access and like maybe some class-based articles that come in, or disadvantage that come into it. I'm thinking though, on the whole, this, or like as a 10,000 foot view, this plan has a pretty good chance of outweighing most disadvantages. I think just because you're talking about the sheer number of students out there, the sheer magnitude of impact when it comes to, like, I was reading some stats on like the average cost to the state is reduced by like $15,000 to $20,000 per student. When you consider the decreased need for remedial education, the decreased need for special education, decreased like even participation in crime. So like when all of those things at a large scale statistically go down with access to pre-K, and I'm sure that like that also maybe includes like those students that don't do as well because of being kind of forced into these square pegs or square holes when like that's not really their thing. I would imagine that like this is a very, very much a net benefits or like a cost benefit kind of round. Like, all right, we get there's going to be some downsides, but like overall, we're doing millions of children a better service and like saving hundreds of millions of dollars. And like, I think you've got a pretty good weighing case here.
Yeah. So, and even that one piece of evidence that I pointed out that kind of throws the solvency into question. That's still mixed. You know what I mean? It's kind of like that's not the end all be all of it, because there is like evidence going back to the 70s about the benefits of pre-K education. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
This one studied one program in particular, and it's not like that represents all preschool programs.
Yeah.
And that's why I think that if you're careful with the plan text, you just kind of avoid it was a Tennessee program, by the way.
Mm.
And so it's like you just avoid the Tennessee model. You go more toward, I don't know, the New York model was the only other one that I saw that sort of contrasted with it. And you start accessing a whole lot of benefits, and the small business disadvantage is, not outweighing that. You know what I mean? I do think that, like, I don't know, like, I'm still a stickler for, or maybe a romantic might be a better word, a romantic for like solvency arguments.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like I'm like, dude, a freaking federal preschool education program. Like, if you want to see someone screw up a program, like, watch this. Like just sit back. You know what I mean? Like, this is gonna be a shit show.
Right.
They're
And
gonna
I would say, like, you can probably argue that, like, Obamacare, right? Like, an attempt to go for something like universal healthcare had hundreds of billions of dollars of like financing backing it in every angle, in every way, shape, and form, right? Like every, hospital, lobbyist, healthcare, pharmaceutical, hospital, like all of them lined up and absolutely got their massive, massive chunk of change. And it still was really not that great. Like, it helped some people get coverage, but then it like added ridiculous, insane wait lists and like huge amount of bureaucracy, and like kind of hurt the middle, and like kind of watered down the quality of care for everyone. So like there were a litany of downsides to something approaching universal coverage, and that's in an industry that has a ton of money like to support it. Now you're talking like just education that is universally like the thing swept under the rug, and now we're going to try and federalize that kind of a system. I think you could make some good, like, you'd still have to give more specific links than just giving the analogies of healthcare. But I think there exists probably plenty of examples of the federal government just bungling large projects, but especially those that don't have funding behind them.
I'd be talking about like No Child Left Behind. That
Sure.
They were. It always like education reforms, like national education initiatives, always devolve down into these statistical sort of generating data, about students type of thing. And it seems like the exact, like, especially for preschool, the exact wrong way to approach it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That trying to, it's like, okay, did they learn their alphabet? It's like, you should, like, that doesn't matter. Like that. And so I can totally see it, like the federal government, it's kind of like, well, we got to justify the money that we're spending here, so let's collect some data. That this might be one of those times where a federalism debate might be the most appropriate.
So I was just about to go there. We talked about this previously. If I were to just say, no, we're going to do a 50 states counter plan and like, leave it up to the states to do whatever they so choose to increase their, pre-K or something like that. I think we'd have to get more crafty with what that counter plan actually sounds like on the negative. But in that circumstance, where can the gov team just perm that and be like, yeah, we're going to, let states do it themselves and we're still solving? Or where is that like too big? I know we talked about it a bit in the federalism debate, but like just kind of circling it back here. Now that we've got a good example.
Anytime you talk about permutations for something like that, my first thing is suspend disbelief. Like just pretend that it actually happened, that the federal government passed this. Like I could imagine that, where the federal government says that preschool is mandatory, and our state of California says, hey, we're going to do our own program. And so what I think, like, my argument would be, it's like, yeah, there's not necessarily disadvantages per se to that, but the confusion that comes from having two different bodies trying to manage the same program is in and of itself is a disadvantage. Like I'd say, like our drug laws, right? We're fighting over whether or not, it's completely legal in California, but it's not really, because you could still get you locked up in federal prison if you get caught. I'm like, what? Like that's completely unfair. Like it is like makes no damn sense whatsoever. Like I think that's just unjust. You know what I mean? But so that's what I go for. It's like if you try to perm a state's counter plan, that you start talking about, it's like comparatively, when you compare the two options, like we could pass two laws that do the same thing and confuse the hell out of people, or pass one law that doesn't confuse people.
Yeah. Like your California preschooler shows up to school with one joint and suddenly now it's yeah. So that's more good reasons for federalism. So I think so there's maybe a good direction. What about any like super squirrely stuff? So I'm sure that there were lots of wild arguments had today. I mean, I like to just it's a very like criticism light, but just a paternalism argument of like the federal government ever doing something that affects people's kids, especially their really young kids, is the absolute wrong actor. Like the federal government does not know best. This is the best definition of paternalism. Look to any instance of the federal government trying to, change policy for children, and it tends to like overstep some kind of boundary. So I guess this is kind of coming full circle back to like parental rights, but like short of like labor laws and like, I don't know, maybe like school vaccinations, whenever there's a federal policy mandating something for young kids, like the younger it gets, the further removed the federal government is.
Like this almost sounds like a paternalism critique.
Right. Yeah. It's a very light version of it. Like there's when we would run this argument, we had very little like lit base or not a ton of theory to back it, but it was still on the subject of like the federal government acting like a parent and then quite literally acting like a parent here. It's like that has a problem in all of these past instances. This is why it's a problem just from a critical perspective, or just from like a linguist or a theoretical perspective, like why the government should not be acting as, someone that knows better. Its sole responsibility is to like keep the people from dying. Right. And development is not their responsibility. Like just because there's some stat that they say that, it costs states $15,000 less. That's probably like one of the points I'd pick at, like, oh, wonderful, you saved your states some money by putting in this program earlier. Like, well, hell, it would be, let's think of all the different ways that we can just make it cheaper on the states to manage their people. That's not the role of the government. So I'd probably just get back to like a core fundamentals. What should the federal government be doing? So maybe that would be paired with a federalism counterplan.
Yeah, like with critiques. So in order to make that critique truly pre-fiat, I mean, you have to explain. I mean, you could kind of, get into it on the like what we are advocating and stuff like that. It's still kind of a post-fiat impact scenario. But still, it's not bad. It's not bad, because the one thing I like about that critique is that it seems really in line with the literature I just came across, where it seems like when you have like a paternalist governmental program, it actually affects the students. Like you can actually see the effects in the students themselves. You know what I mean? It's like the results of that program are that they rebel. You know what I mean? They fight back. You know what I mean? It's kind of like it's kind of like it. They take that resentment and it embody it. You know what I mean? That it becomes part of their sort of perspective on the world, because that the government said, well, you got to go to school, and it's like, all right, now sit down, shut up, and write your ABCs. That. You could talk about how, like, I love intergenerational impacts. You could talk about how that create intergenerational impacts, because you're, at such a young age, you're basically, kind of pushing people to be sort of distrustful of things like, I
think I remember when kind of pressed for some theory on it, I think we'd go with like Pedagogy of the Oppressed, like Paulo Freire, and talk about like the banking model of education in Brazil, kind of creating all of these really nasty impacts, and then like a more dialogic process of learning, having better outcomes, where it is still looking at like large scale educational principles, but it has a whole lot more like, I guess you call it like pre-fiat theory into it, of like where the students view the world, how they interact with education, like how do they feel about learning, right? Like a population that is you know, a little antagonistic to learning is gonna have some difficulties later in life. But then I would also want to go the opposite. Like, I'm sure there's a ton of really good literature from Europe of like what they do, but I'd be interested also like what China and Japan and Korea do for pre-K. I have no idea. Maybe it's like way more robust than this, or maybe it's like completely free form. Maybe they don't have it at all. Like, those would be the things that I would be researching really quick to try and, on the subject of models, try and figure out where else is doing this and how they're doing it, to get some better, you know, feelings on it.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's the fact that they're coming up with sort of conflicting data makes it a really hard debate, because like you got this you know, one article here that is saying it's like, oh well, if you could screw it up, and then there's a bunch of literature that says that like any sort of education kind of, you know, gets them on a fast track and stuff like that. And so those studies are dense. You know what I mean? It's like you can't really unpackage that in a parley round where you can't bring evidence in. You know what I mean? It's like that. Yeah. It starts becoming policy level debate stuff. You know what I mean? That where you got to really kind of look at the methodology and the credibility of the publication, and you know what I mean? It's like all that sort of analysis that you can't really get into on a parley level. So on one level, it's just like, yeah, this might be beyond what can be resolved in a parley round.
Well, if it isn't quite as dense, or isn't, you know, quite dense enough for an entire year-long LD or policy round, I think it would at least be good fodder for a high school LD or public forum, where it's like a month or two for a topic. Like that would be a good one to you know, take into it, dig into it, but go for short.
So interesting stuff. It's a good topic. I you know what, and I do think the way that they wrote it, the wording of it actually gave the negative like some ground to argue. Whereas if they're just like, this house would implement a universal preschool program, like if it was that generic, like I think the affirmative would have way more sort of preference and presumption on that. But the way that it's worded right now, like if the negative was smart, they could really capitalize on some of the implications.
Yeah.
All right.
Good stuff.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Hey, that's what we got for this week. I'm coming at you from St. Charles, Missouri. We got Tim still in San Diego. We'll see you
next week. Good luck to SEC with their Nationals run.
Yeah. Ooh. Oh, man. Congratulations. All right. Bye.